In the dark shadows of World War II, hidden beneath the icy plains of northeastern China, a secret complex operated by the Japanese Imperial Army carried out one of the most horrific chapters in human history. It was known as Unit 731, officially called the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. But what really happened inside its barbed wire fences had nothing to do with disease prevention or water treatment. Instead, it was the epicenter of biological warfare development and gruesome human experimentation. At its peak, Unit 731 employed over 3,000 personnel, including scientists, doctors, and military officers, all of whom were engaged in grotesque and inhumane experiments on living human beings, most of whom were Chinese civilians and prisoners of war. Founded in 1936 under the leadership of Surgeon General Shiro Ishii, a brilliant but sadistic microbiologist, Unit 731 was built in Pingfang, near the city of Harbin in Japanese-occupied Manchuria. Ishii believed that biological weapons would be the future of warfare and convinced the Japanese military elite to support his vision. What followed was a decade-long reign of terror, concealed from the world and cloaked in absolute secrecy. Thousands of men, women, and children, some as young as infants, were brought into the facility, stripped of their names and referred to only as logs, a dehumanizing term used to describe test subjects. The experiments carried out inside Unit 731 defy comprehension. Prisoners were deliberately infected with deadly pathogens, plague, anthrax, cholera, typhus, and syphilis, just to see how long it would take for them to die. Some were injected with multiple diseases at once. Victims would scream in agony as their bodies were ravaged by infection, and no anesthetics were given. Doctors monitored their decline with clinical detachment, taking notes as organs failed and flesh turned black. Once a subject was no longer useful, they were dissected alive in a procedure known as a vivisection. Organs were removed one by one while the patient was fully conscious. The heart was often the last to be extracted. One of the most gruesome aspects of Unit 731 was its obsession with frostbite. Since the Japanese military anticipated fighting in cold climates, Ishii wanted to learn the best way to treat frostbite and hypothermia. To that end, prisoners were marched naked into sub-zero temperatures and forced to stay outside until their limbs froze solid. Then, their arms or legs were struck with sticks to test how frozen they were. If a sound like wood striking stone was heard, the freezing was considered complete. At that point, the limb would be immersed in hot water, and researchers would observe the damage as the tissue thawed, often leading to massive blisters, necrosis, and eventual death. Sometimes the limbs were amputated and reattached to different parts of the body. It wasn't science. It was torture masked as research. The horror didn't end there. Pregnant women, often impregnated by other prisoners or by guards, were subjected to experiments to study vertical disease transmission. Fetuses were removed in late-term pregnancies without anesthesia. Newborns were infected with diseases to study how fast and in what way they would deteriorate. Other victims were subjected to weapons testing. Flamethrowers were used on live prisoners. Grenades were detonated near their bodies to observe wound patterns, and pressure chambers were used to see how long a human could survive under extreme compression. Some were injected with horse urine or gasoline just to see what would happen. Chemical weapons were also a focus. Victims were exposed to mustard gas, cyanide, and other lethal agents. Researchers wanted to observe how different chemicals attacked the skin, lungs, and nervous system. Entire villages in China were infected with biological agents, contaminated food and water were distributed, and aircraft dropped plague-infested fleas onto towns, causing mass outbreaks. These were field tests designed to evaluate the effectiveness of Japan's biological arsenal. They had no regard for civilian life. Some estimates suggest that over 400,000 people died as a direct result of these attacks. Unit 731 wasn't the only facility involved. There were several sister units scattered across China and Southeast Asia, each focusing on different aspects of biological and chemical warfare. But Unit 731 was the largest, most advanced, and most sadistic. Despite its monstrous activities, it operated with complete impunity. The soldiers and scientists believed they were doing work vital to Japan's victory in the war, and many of them even took pride in their roles. There was no remorse, no hesitation. When Japan surrendered in 1945, the Americans arrived in Japan and soon learned about Unit 731. But instead of prosecuting Ishii and his colleagues for war crimes, the US struck a deal. In exchange for their data on biological warfare, the members of Unit 731 were granted full immunity. The US government believed the information was too valuable to destroy, and that it could give them an edge in the early stages of the Cold War. Shido Ishii and many of his staff went on to have successful careers in medicine, academia, and business. Not a single member of Unit 731 was ever tried or punished by an international court. Their victims were forgotten by history for decades. The Soviet Union did conduct some trials of captured Unit 731 personnel in Khabarovsk in 1949, revealing more details about the experiments. But these trials were dismissed by the West as propaganda. It wasn't until the 1980s and 1990s that survivors and whistleblowers began speaking out, pushing the Japanese government to acknowledge what had happened. Even then, Japan has never formally apologized for the atrocities committed by Unit 731. Most Japanese textbooks do not even mention it. Today, the site of Unit 731 in Pingfang has been turned into a museum, a chilling reminder of the horrors that can unfold when science is divorced from ethics and humanity. The buildings, though damaged by time and war, still stand. Inside, visitors can see the autopsy tables, the cells where prisoners were kept, and the remains of instruments used in the experiments. Photographs and testimonies line the walls, bearing silent witness to the agony of thousands. The legacy of Unit 731 is not just a story of cruelty. It is a story about silence, denial, and the consequences of moral collapse. It reminds us that under the right conditions, ordinary people can commit unimaginable evil. The doctors and scientists of Unit 731 were not monsters in appearance. Many were well-educated, respected, and rational. But in the name of nationalism, scientific progress, and blind obedience, they turned human beings into lab rats, discarded when no longer useful. It is impossible to fully grasp the suffering endured by the victims of Unit 731. Their pain was hidden for too long, their stories buried beneath decades of denial and political deals. But their memory demands to be heard. Their suffering must be remembered, not just as a historical footnote, but as a warning. Because atrocities like these don't begin with hate. They begin with indifference. They begin when we allow convenience, fear, or ambition to eclipse our basic sense of right and wrong. If we forget the story of Unit 731, we risk allowing it to happen again.